Orders. All right, so welcome to Heaven on Earth. We're going to be having a virtual tour of the Holy Temple. So you're going to see in quite great detail. We're going to recreate and rebuild as much as we can what the temple looked like and what different parts were used for, etc., etc. In addition, the reason why we're specifically choosing to learn this now is because it's the appropriate thing to learn when we mourn the destruction of the temple, study about the temple. That's how we merit to have the rebuilding of the temple. So during this lesson, we're going to kind of not get to the actual temple itself, but really talk about the surrounding temple. So many of you, when I talk about the temple, what am I talking about? So everyone knows of what's called the Western Wall, or called the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, still today, that you can go at. Here's a picture of what it looks like. Of course, the Western Wall is a very important place to Jewish people. Everyone goes there to pray. It's a holy site. We're going to talk more about it. It was a tremendous source of joy. 1967, when the Israeli army, here you can see Moshe Dayan and other people, that when we were victorious in 1967, were able to free Jerusalem and the Western Wall from the enemies, and we came there. Here's Prime Minister Levi Eshkol visiting. I mean, it was a huge deal. Very famous words. They came. These are pictures of the first time that Jewish soldiers were able to once again access, these sites which belong, of course, to Jewish people, and so on and so forth. So here's actually an old picture that you're looking at, which is of the temple from many, many years ago. So of the Kotel, of this wall from many, many years ago. Here again, you have Jews. I don't know exactly how many years ago this picture is, but it's a picture from many years ago, of course. Jews have always been visiting the site, somewhat of a more modern picture. So when we talk about the Kotel, this Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, which part of the temple are we talking about? Does anybody know? Where exactly on this temple would we be talking about that it was? The answer is it's
the foundation.
Sorry?
It's the foundation. Below the level of the Temple Mount.
It's behind the Holy of Holies, meaning it's the closest wall to the Holy of Holies.
So yes, everyone is correct. It's on the west, which you're going to see that the west is, that's the west over there. That's the western side. We'll talk about that in a minute, but it wasn't an actual wall of the temple building. It was a building, it was a wall, as Ken said, more of the outside of the edges of the wall of Temple Mount, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So here is just a drawing of what the second temple looked like. So when we talk about the temple, what are we talking about? Here it is. We'll talk about the dimensions in a couple minutes, but the structure, you can see this is all Temple Mount, this kind of empty space all around, and then you got the actual temple structure, and we'll talk about that in a minute, as I said. So just a brief history. How did we come to make a temple? Where does this whole idea of a temple come from? The answer is that it started when the Jewish people were still in the desert. So as a nation, it's recorded in the Torah, right? Jewish people left Egypt, and we spent 40 years in the desert. During those 40 years in the desert, we got an instruction from Hashem. God instructed Moses to instruct the Jewish people to build a place, a home, a temple, some sort of a sanctuary for Hashem. As the Rambam puts it, there's a positive commandment. So there's a biblical commandment for us to build a home, a house for Hashem, in which we can bring sacrifices. So that was kind of the primary purpose of that first temple that they built while still in the desert, which was a mobile temple. And also, it should be a place where Jews are able to come at the minimum 3 times a year on the holidays of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, on those 3 holidays, and celebrate, with God, with each other in that temple. So when the Jewish people were in the desert, it was not this big, nice structure that you see over here. It was much smaller, and it was on the very basic minimum kind of comprised of 2 rooms. One room you see over there, which was called the Holy of Holies, with this ark, and this other room where we have the menorah, right, the candelabra, incense altar, and a showbread table. And that was kind of and then there was an outside space, and that was kind of the basic makeup of the temple called the Mishkan, Tabernacle, while we were in the desert.
What did you call that table?
I called it the showbread table. So on this table, they would keep specially made bread, and once a week they would exchange the bread, and the Kohanim, the priests that would serve in the temple, would be able to eat this bread. We'll get a little bit of a closer look at the actual items that were inside the temple after we finish discussing the structure. So the commandment originated when the Jewish people were in the desert, and they had a temple which looked like this. This was mobile. This was like a pack up and go tent. These walls, as you can see over here, were able to separate one from another, and they were able to pack it all up and move, because that's how the Jewish people were during their time in the desert. They would have to kind of move from one location to the next. Eventually, when Jewish people came and settled in Israel, and King David established Jerusalem as the capital city, and they built the temple under King Solomon, that was obviously a permanent structure. But during the 40 years in the desert, and then later when they went into Israel for the first few hundred years, this structure was a temporary structure. It was movable, etc. So the original instruction comes from Hashem, as I said. The way Maimonides defines it is that we have an obligation to make a place where we can come and bring sacrifices, and Jews can gather there, as I said, the minimum 3 times a year. And the words in the actual Torah are, "Va'asu li mikdash," you should make for me a temple, "V'shachanti b'socham," and I will dwell in them. So what are we doing over here, studying all of this? Why aren't we going to Jerusalem to build a temple? So of course, as I said before, we are in exile and we're unable to build it, but it's still very important to learn about it. And I'll read to you a very interesting midrash that says as follows. Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, said to God, "Master of the universe, through this moment we have been exiled in the land of those who hate us. Yet you say to me that I should go and tell Israel the form of the temple and write it down before their eyes, so that they should preserve it. So they should preserve its form and its laws." Because the prophet Ezekiel wrote down what the temple should look like. So he said to God, "Why should I? Are they able to do this? Let them be, don't tease them until after they come out of exile, and then I will go and tell them." So the Holy One, blessed be He, said to Ezekiel, "Just because my children are exiled, should I let the building of my house be brought to nothing?" The blessed Hashem, God said, the Holy One, blessed be He, said, "Reading about it in the Torah," so studying about the temple, "is as great as actually building it. Go tell them that they should involve themselves with reading about the form of the temple, and as a reward for involving themselves about it, I will account it for them as if they were actually involved in building the temple." So by studying about it, it's kind of in some form or some level considered that we are actually building it as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the first temple. As I mentioned to you before, the Jewish people left Egypt under the leadership of Moses. They spent 40 years in the desert. During those 40 years, they built the first temple. It was movable, it was small, it was pack up and go, etc. After 40 years in the desert, under the leadership of Joshua, the Jewish people went into the land of Israel. And for the first 480 years, when the Jewish people were in Israel, they too used that same form that Moses had originally built. They did not build a permanent place. Till eventually came King David, and King David was the one that established Jerusalem as the capital city of the Jewish people. And he said to Hashem, he said to God, "I want to be the one to build you, a home temple that's fitting for you." And God told King David, that he's not going to be the one to build the temple, because God said, your hands are full of blood. King David was a man that went to many, many, many wars. And God said, the temple is a place of peace. You are not going to be the one to build it. King David drew the plans for it. He decided where it would be and all sorts of those different things, but he wasn't the actually one that built it. We all know that, of course, his son, King Solomon, was the one that eventually landed up building the actual temple itself. Any questions or comments?
So Solomon was in effect the, I don't want to say supervisor.
So Solomon was the king of Israel and the Jewish people at the time when the temple was built. So it was under his leadership and under his reign that they built it, but he himself wasn't a builder. He himself hired, the best of what Israel had at the time in terms of architects and in terms of builders, and they came and they built the actual temple itself. The other thing is that a group of people called Kohanim, which we still have today, who is a Kohen, were in charge of operating the temple. And there was somewhat of a hierarchy. There was a high priest called the Kohen Gadol, who was, primarily in charge. Then there was like an assistant to the high priest. So there became a very organized system in who was running the place. The Levites also were involved. They would play music, and they would be in charge of guarding it 24 hours a day. Obviously not, just because of how holy it was. So it was under King Solomon as king, but he didn't, I don't know to what degree he became site supervisor, but it was a huge, massive task that, and also the temple was improved numerous different times. It was built and then they added to it, etc. The actual details that we're going to be talking about are not from the King Solomon's temple. We don't have so many of those details. We're going to be looking at what did the temple look like in the second temple. So King Solomon builds a temple, and that temple lasts for 410 years. After 410 years, it's destroyed by a man called Nebuchadnezzar, who has this army who we call the Babylonians, because they were coming from Babylon. And the Jewish people go into exile. They return from exile like 70 years later under the leadership of a man called Ezra and Nehemiah, and they rebuild the second temple. And this second temple is also, by the way, built in stages. It's built and then it's redone, because at first it was built. So the recordings that we're going to be looking at, or the dimensions that we're going to be looking at, is the second temple, also like halfway through the second temple after it's revised and rebuilt. So here you have destruction of the first temple.
Rabbi, quick question.
Sure.
Mishkan and temple, is it the same thing?
So I was talking about the Mishkan before. The Mishkan they call in English the Tabernacle. That's the tent-like structure that they built while the Jewish people were in the desert. So it's the predecessor of the temple itself. It was built as a result of the instruction from Hashem to build a temple. But when the Jewish people were in the desert, they didn't build a permanent structure. They built a temporary structure, which could be, taken down like a tent-like structure. But the inside, in terms of what items they had in the inside, was the same, both in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, the one they had in the 40 years of the desert, and later on in the temple, the actual items that they had inside and the service that was done, the sacrifices, etc., was the same.
Got it.
So here you have just an interesting thing when we talk about the Babylonians destroying the first temple. Who were the Babylonians or whatever? They found a Babylonian arrowhead unearthed in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is one of those places where they do a tremendous amount of archaeological excavation. So we have all sorts of unbelievable things that have happened. So as I mentioned, then after the Jewish people were in exile, during that exile between the first and second temple is when the story of Purim happened. So if you're familiar with the whole story of Purim, the book of Esther. That happened between the destruction of the first temple and the rebuilding of the second temple. And then under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, Jewish people made their way back to Jerusalem, back to Israel, and they started to rebuild the temple. So let's talk a little bit more about it. Now that you have a brief overview, a brief history, and of course, we believe very strongly that when Mashiach comes, we are going to rebuild the third temple. The third temple, which we are promised, is never going to be destroyed. So we've had a Mishkan, a tabernacle. We've had a first temple under King Solomon. That's been destroyed. We've had a second temple, now it's destroyed. And now we're waiting, of course, to rebuild the third temple, which will be when Mashiach comes. So here you have an aerial satellite image of Temple Mount. Recently in the news, Temple Mount has been receiving a lot of attention. For some reason, a couple other people think that it has something to do with them. Still unsure exactly why, but each to their own, I suppose. So here you go. This is Temple Mount area satellite image as well, getting a little bit closer. You can see what's called the Dome of the Rock, which when you think about it, you know, there's not really any greater tragedy than having a mosque on the Temple Mount, which is where the Beit Hamikdash, the temple, belongs and is going to be built. And that's what it means to be in exile.
So the Dome of the Rock will be destroyed at the time of the three temples.
Don't ask me those questions on recordings. I'm just checking. Yes, everything is going to be a renovation. Now, before we actually talk about, you know, the specifics, the Temple Mount location is mentioned in many different places before the temple was built, even in the times of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that's already 2,000 years before the actual temple was built. This was already a location which was a special place. So many of you are familiar with the story where Jacob goes to sleep and he has a dream of a ladder. And then when he wakes up in the morning, the words is, he says, behold, Hashem, God is in this place and I did not know it. And the commentaries tell us that he was actually lying on this Temple Mount. Tradition has it that that's the same location where Noah came out, where Noah went and he built an altar after he came out from the ark. Tradition has it that it's the same location where Cain and Abel brought their sacrifices, which didn't turn out too well for Abel. And tradition has it that this is the place from where God created the first human beings as well. So it's not like it's just this random place. From the beginning of creation, this was a space that was dedicated and specified for to be a special place, as we said. So that's where creation began. Cain and Abel brought their sacrifice. Apparently, it's the same place where Abraham brought Isaac as a sacrifice, or almost brought him as a sacrifice. Jacob had his dream over here, etc. So obviously, Temple Mount is a mountain, right? It's a mountain. It's an elevated place. And here you're going to see what is around this mountain from all the different sides. So here you're looking at a picture where you are seeing the Temple Mount. So it's kind of up a mountain from a place called the Kidron Valley. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a circle now around Temple Mount as if we're at the bottom of the mountain. And where would we be standing if we were looking at the mountain going up? So right now, just to give you a little bit of picture, we are on the east side. So before we spoke about the western wall. So we're on the other side of where the western wall would be. We're on the east side and we're going clockwise. So if you go clockwise starting east, where are you going next? So we're going to start on the east and we're going to go
Oh.
south, then we'll go west, and then we will come to the north. So on the eastern side, you have this thing called the Kidron Valley, and as it sounds like, it's a valley called the Valley of Kidron. Today, there's an Arab neighborhood known as the Silwan, which is located over here in this Kidron Valley. So going, rising sharply to the east of the Kidron Valley is something called Har Hazaisim, Mount Olives. Anybody ever heard of Mount Olives? Mount Olives is a very famous mountain in Jerusalem. It is a very famous cemetery, actually. It is today one of the largest Jewish burial grounds in the world. I know my grandfather's buried over there, my great-grandfather's buried over there. A lot of, just tons of people that have been buried over there for thousands or hundreds of years. So as we're kind of going around this mountain, you have this Kidron Valley, which we said is an Arab neighborhood, and then kind of going clockwise, we're getting to the Mount Olives. And as we continue on, we're going to the south. That is what we call Ir David, the city of David. And that is during Davidic times, that was the place which was inhabited. So the rest of it wasn't really inhabited. Here you see in the picture Temple Mount and the Mount of Olives. So if you can see the picture, here we are, Temple Mount. And if I'm understanding this correctly, this is Temple Mount. This is the Mount Olives right over here. So that's cemetery, that's if you kind of see. So it's this mountain, which is kind of, you have people buried, you know, as you go up all the way up. I'm assuming that this is this valley that we were talking about a couple minutes ago. Here's probably an Arab village called the Silwan village. And this is Mount Olives right over here. So now, interestingly, what you're looking at is, we said after you get to the Mount of Olives and you continue, you get to what's called Ir David, the city of David. And we mentioned this before, but I told you that Jerusalem has a tremendous amount of excavation and archaeological digging. This is a archaeological digging that they found in the Ir David, in the city of David, which is supposed to be an ancient house, obviously somewhat back in ruins. And if you're talking about something from Ir David, from the original city of David, means you're going back to the first times, the first temple. So this is approximately 3,500 years ago, 3,500 years ago, what archaeologists are finding now. And I'm not an archaeologist, but obviously based on their understanding of that period in history, they understand that this is the remains of a house over here. All right, so that pretty much takes us up to we started in the east, we went to the south, going up to the west. So this is the west side road. So now we're on the west of Temple Mount. So just to give you an idea, we started over here on the east. Okay. So if this is the actual temple, this structure at the bottom of here would be the temple, and this box around it would be the actual Temple Mount. So this was the east. That's what we said the Kidron Valley was, and we kind of went this way, which is going to be the south. That's where we had Mount of Olives and Ir David over here, and now we're on this side, which is the west. So on this west, there was a big giant road called the Taropian Way. And on this side of the Temple Mount is, if you're familiar with what's called the Damascus Gate nowadays. And on this side, a lot of people lived there during the times of the Second Temple. So what I mentioned to you before was that during the times of David, people were primarily living over here on the southern side. But during the times of the Second Temple, people were primarily living over here on the western side. So kind of Jerusalem kind of shifted a little bit. This is where the modern Jewish and Armenian quarters are found. So if you're familiar with Jerusalem's Armenian quarters, this is where you will find the Armenian quarters over here on the western side. Yeah, so if you're taking a look at Western Jerusalem, we are talking about right over here. See, this is all the west of Jerusalem. So here you have the Western Wall. The Western Wall is obviously on the western side, but all of this is called Western Jerusalem. See that? So just to explain again, this is the eastern side. And here we have
South.
the south, what we spoke about before with the, you know, and then here we have the west. So here you have, this is where a lot of people live in Jerusalem still today. We're going to talk about this a little bit more, but if you see the Western Wall, you see the Western Wall is only this little bit amount of space, and you don't see any more Western Wall over here, even though the actual Temple Mount extends a whole lot further on. Now to the north, which would be now on this side, is the mountain kind of extends. So the actual Temple Mount, which we're describing as this temple, and then at the bottom, kind of lower than it, if you go north, the mountain kind of ridge continues. So it doesn't really slope down, it continues more of a mountain, and it's quite a flat expanse. I'm not completely familiar with what is happening there today. So that gives you a little bit of a picture of what's happening at the bottom of Temple Mount. So we start with this Kidron Valley and the Mount of Olives, and where the Ir David, the city of David, Western Jerusalem, and with not much happening over here in the north. So let's continue a little bit more. The actual construction of the temple. So we are going to be talking about, as I mentioned before, the temple, the way it was built during the times of the Second Temple, in the times of Herod. Anybody familiar with Herod?
Mm-hmm.
What do you know about Herod? So
He was a
Herod
builder.
himself was appointed as the leader by the Romans of Israel. They appointed him. You know, he was the Roman leader of Israel. What were you going to say?
He built a lot.
Right.
In,
He built
in Israel.
He built Masada and a bunch of other different things. He has built. So he's the one who rebuilt the Second Temple and made it the most magnificent and a tremendous structure during his time. So when we focus on the Second Temple, we're talking about this building that Herod built, to the point that the Talmud says whoever did not see the building of Herod has never really seen a true beautiful building in his life. He was responsible for building in Akko, that's Herod. He was responsible for building Masada, that's also Herod's time. He's responsible for building in Caesarea, and he was responsible for the rebuilding or the updo of the Second Temple, which is what you're looking at right over here. So this is kind of Temple Mount. This, of course, is the west, and this is the actual structure of the temple, which he built. He took an existing temple and just built onto it and made it much more beautiful and magnificent than it was previously. All right, so just to talk a little bit about the style of construction that they used in those times. There was no modern day big machinery, right? Everything was done. So what they did is he extended the actual top of the Temple Mount, and they built these kind of retaining walls using this kind of structure that you're seeing over here, plateau, or however that's pronounced, construction. And they built these retaining walls that enable the top of Temple Mount to be actually bigger than it ever was. So you could be standing at the bottom of Temple Mount and you would see these giant, huge, massive stones, as you can see over here. The stones that Herod used for these retaining walls were massive, extremely large stones. They're called ashlars, Ashlars. Some of them, by the way, which are still visible today. They have stones. The largest stone that they still have today from that Herod era that he used as retaining walls is 570 tons, 44 feet long, 10 feet high, and 12 to 16 feet deep, which is pretty impressive that they were using those stones before without machinery.
Rabbi, do you mean 540 tons?
But it says in my book, 570 tons.
Yeah. Okay. You said, all right. Sorry, I misunderstood you. That's what I thought. Okay.
So again, the largest rock that we're still seeing from the remaining of these retainer walls that he built, because interestingly enough, the western wall is not the only part of a remaining wall. There are other parts to remaining walls that are still there as well. So, but the largest rock that they're seeing that he used is 570 tons, 44 feet long, 10 feet high, and 12 to 16 feet deep.
So that's what they had to bring from Rome.
Yes. Well, they probably set it ablaze, but that's what they were dealing with. But just to compare it, if you talk about the stones that they were using in the Great Pyramids in Egypt, the biggest stone that we have recorded that they used in Egypt is 11 tons. So from 11 tons to 570 tons, the construction seemingly had advanced quite a bit from Egypt times to Herod's times.
And he said he burnt it, obviously kept it on the stone. So they.
Well, you could just
got
imagine
into the-
an invading army of thousands of soldiers just, busting their way through and killing people along the way and burning things, destroying things, smashing things. The interesting thing is about these stones is that they were smooth and they had a little bit of a margin around them. I guess we're talking about this kind of margin right over here. And that margin is one of Herod's trademarks. That's the way he prepared all of his stones. Not really such an expert in construction, and I'm for sure not an expert in construction in 2,000 years ago, but that's what it says in my book over here. And it's just interesting because they've obviously done, just being honest, they've done a lot of research about this, obviously, because these are rocks. You're looking at a picture now of a wall that still stands today. And one of the things that they see is that it's very smooth, and all of the rocks have this margin around them. If you see, there's a little indent in all of these rocks. And apparently that was one of Herod's trademarks. I mean, the man was obviously a tremendous, he accomplished a tremendous amount. Apparently he was extremely paranoid as well. But when you see these stones that are very smooth and have these margins, that's a trademark of Herod's time, where that's what the stones look like. So here you can see, you're looking at the Temple Mount now from on top, but before we were talking about the way that he built up, the top of what Temple Mount should look like. So he built these retaining walls that there should be this, took a mountain, but then flattened a specific part of the mountain that it should be completely smooth and that it should be able to be built on top using these giant rocks and this way that he built. So we are going to begin by talking about the Temple Mount's outer walls. We're going to begin by talking about the western outer wall of the Temple Mount. Now, this is the temple. When we talk about the western wall of today, this is the wall that we're talking about. So we're talking about the western wall of the Temple Mount compound, basically. So it wasn't actually a wall that was part of the temple structure. It was a wall that was part of the Temple Mount compound. Now, I mentioned this to you before, but when you see the temple, when you see the Western Wall today, you're looking at, you know, a piece of the Western Wall. The Western Wall itself was much longer and much larger. We are only we're only seeing a small part of the Western Wall today. So when we talk about the Western Wall of today, we're talking about this piece right over here. This is the Western Wall that we're talking about in today's day and age. But there's, you know, much more to the Western Wall. But this is the Western Wall that we're talking about today.
So the reason we don't see the rest of it is because they haven't excavated the yet, or it's just not there.
I think part of it is still there. We just don't have access to it.
One thing that this reminds me of, telling me that he was at San Antonio, or the last one is the Alamo. The Alamo was a mission built by the Catholic Church, but the wall that we see from the visit cemetery today is actually a wall because it was not only a mission, but it was a fort.
That's interesting.
So they had, at that time, they had cannons inside. Fiercely defended.
We're going to talk a little bit about that also, because when they did come to destroy this temple, there was the Jerusalem wall, which is not even what we're talking about, because that's what was destroyed today. But the actual temple itself also had a wall, and when it came time to it, people were, you know, hiding inside the temple. Gary, you asked, why didn't Israel ever take over the entire land and everything around it? I don't have the answer to that question. It's a mix probably of political and religious. It's probably primarily political, you know, because what's being, if Israel goes and takes away, technically Israel is in charge of the Temple Mount. I mean, the soldiers can go in there whenever they want. But as you can see recently, it didn't exactly lead to such good things. So when we talk about this Western Wall, if you're talking about during the times of Herod's temple, if you can see over here, there was a very wide street, and there was an overpass, which is this overpass right over here. So people could enter Temple Mount through this overpass. And then over here at the bottom, there was, by the way, just to explain more, could you see this black square? That's the part of Temple Mount that we're seeing today. So we're seeing like that's the part of the Western Wall that we're seeing today, is this black square. So it is a lot more, I mean, much of it was destroyed, or some of it still stands today, but it's not, you know, we don't have access to it. So right over here at the bottom was a very wide street, and that was pretty much a shuk. You know what a shuk is? A market. So people would set up shop over there, and they would sell animals for sacrifices or whatever other needs that people might need when coming to the temple, because it obviously created a whole market, created a whole economy, right? People were coming, they would need animals. If it was Passover, they would need other things. So this became like a pretty wide street where it was a little bit of a shuk, a little bit of a marketplace. And as you can see, there were, this was an entrance, one of the entrances used to get onto Temple Mount. And this was also an entrance to get onto Temple Mount, but this was something else, which maybe we'll see in a couple of minutes what was happening over there. So that was the Western Wall. So we just spoke about over here, right here, the Western Wall. So now we're going on to the Northern Wall. And if you use this diagram right here at the bottom, we're talking about here, this Northern Wall right over here. So let's take a look at what the northern wall looked like. This is the northern wall today from inside of the Temple Mount. This doesn't look like a very updated picture. So the northern wall was always the weakest spot when it came to defending the temple. On all other sides, there was a sharp drop. So you just finished looking at the western side and you saw there was a wall with like a sharp drop. You had to, if you wanted to enter, you wanted to enter Temple Mount, you had to use this overpass. So the people had to secure the overpass. But on the northern side, we spoke about this before, the Temple Mount kind of extended. So there wasn't this sharp drop. So that became one of the harder sides to defend. So during the times of the Second Temple, they stationed thousands of soldiers over there to try and make sure that it wasn't attacked. Now, if you go into Temple Mount today and you look towards the north, you can still see remains of the actual wall itself, which is what you're looking at over here. I'm not sure exactly why this is such an old picture. And you'll see a lot of stones over there that are typical of that Herodian era, which are these very large stones with the grooves around them, as we said before. Now it's interesting, if you look very carefully, you'll see over here that this wall actually is two different style walls. Do you see that? Like over here, halfway through, the style of the wall actually changes. So many have said that they believe that this, going this way, which the stones are much bigger and they have they look like Herod's time, this is where Herod extended the wall. And this perhaps is a remaining wall even from the times of the first temple. So that's why it looks quite a lot different. All right, so that is we have our western wall, which is where the western wall that we know today is. Temple times, there was that big, large street thoroughfare where people would have a market. Spoke about the northern side, which had that wall. A lot of soldiers used to be stationed over there, and there was no drop. And now we're going on to the eastern wall. The eastern wall today, you see this over here. So this is on the east side. I guess you just kind of see what it looked like, when they built. Clearly, it doesn't look like modern day buildings. Still standing, so it's pretty impressive. And lastly, we have the southern wall, which is, this is what it would have looked like on the side of the southern wall. On the side of the southern wall during temple times, there was a walkway and a large public square. Yeah, this is what you're looking at from the southern side today. Looks pretty nice, doesn't it? So if you were going to the south side today and you would look up at Temple Mount, this is what you would be looking at.
Is that a fountain?
Is this a fountain, or was the next one a fountain?
No, previous slide.
This one?
Yeah.
So, not a fountain, but interesting, talking about on the southern side, they have over here a mikvah that is attributed to temple times. So Gary's pointing out that on the previous slide, let me go back, you can see Gary, do you want to speak up? On the you can see where different conquerors added heights to existing walls, right? So you can probably
It would be the slide before that one, I think.
this one, right? So you can see, is that what you're saying? You kind of see how it's different pieces added on at different times.
I think it was the eastern wall where you can see differences of architecture and brick as different conquerors raised the wall.
This one?
It wasn't that one. No, is that eastern? There, that one there. Look up in the corner, up the upper left.
Right. You're saying you see like smaller ones and bigger ones and different styles. Absolutely right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. They would have taken the existing wall and added to it. So getting back to the south side, which this is the south side today, they have over here, they found in archaeological digging a mikveh. So what is a mikveh? Mikveh is, of course, a ritual bath where people would go and people still go for ritual purity. So it could be a bath where the water would be either rainwater or spring water, or however the design would be. And this would be typical also because people, before they would have to go into the temple, would have to make sure that they were pure. So if they had come into contact with a dead body or they had done all sorts of different things, they would have to wait a certain amount of time, immerse themselves in a mikveh, and then go on to Temple Mount. You weren't allowed onto Temple Mount if you were not pure. So here you have on the south side, what archaeologists found is somewhat of a mikveh of old. I'm assuming that these weeds and flowers were growing in there back in the day, but a little bit of a picture of what's happening on the south side. Here you have, this is what they discovered, and this is, you can see it's clearly a mikveh. These are the stairs. A person would go, down 3 stairs, immerse their body in water, and that would be it. All right, so we spoke about all of these 4 different walls, what's happening on all 4 different sides. And if you can see highlighted in white were the different entrances. These were the entrance points that a person could use to actually enter onto Temple Mount. So this is the western side, again, because this is north, south, and east and west. So on the western side, you had 4 entrances. This entrance over here, or this entrance over here, one of them was that overpass that I showed you on the western side. A bunch more entrances on the western side, which also made sense because early on we explained that during the era of the Second Temple, most people were living on the west of Temple Mount. That was kind of the Jerusalem where people lived. So it would make sense that they added 4 entrances over here. On the north side, there was 1 entrance, and on all the other sides, there was 1 entrance as well. This is what it looks like in reconstructed. So here you have, we're looking at the west side over here. So this is the western wall that we know today. Here is the entrances, what we spoke about before. Here's 1 entrance. There would be another entrance. These 2 orange things would be an entrance as well, but they would actually enter you kind of under the compound. It doesn't seem like they would get you entrance straight on top. Here, this is the eastern side. You can see also over like an overpass. This is the north, where it just kind of extends. That's the wall that we spoke about, where there would be a lot of soldiers. And here is the southern side, which is what we were just looking at a minute ago. This is where there was a big public square. This is the mikveh that we were talking about a minute ago. And there were entrances onto Temple Mount as well on the southern side.
I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but in Mexico, there's a lot of pyramids that you can visit if you go. And I was there a couple of years ago, and they had similar structures as the Mikvah in your picture attached to these pyramids.
The idea of immersing in water for purification is all across the board. Even the Christians or a lot of people do it. It's interesting that Mexico. I don't know.
Yeah, the tour guide explained that was their way of providing water to the community. It was
Mhm.
That's where you left your thing.
Interesting. So here we have, again, looking at the entrances, this is the eastern entrance, and a view from the Kidron Valley. So if you remember a couple early on in the class, we spoke when we were talking, describing the actual Temple Mount, looking at it from the bottom. We spoke about it. We started in the east, and we said the east was called the Kidron Valley. So here we are in the Kidron Valley, looking into the eastern entrance of the Temple Mount. And there was a double archway. This is kind of what it looked like, the entrance. And it has been sealed. This gate has been sealed for centuries already. It's called Shar HaRachamim, the Gate of Mercy. So this is kind of what it looked like, the eastern entrance. Here you can see that it's actually sealed. Remember I said it's sealed. So this is a view from the Mount of Olives, which is that cemetery that we were talking about before. And you're looking at the eastern wall of Temple Mount. And this was the entrance, and it's completely sealed, as it has been for many generations. Now this is a view from the other side. So if you were standing on Temple Mount, as you can see in the corner, so this is if you're standing off Temple Mount looking onto Temple Mount, and this is the other way around. If you're standing on the Temple Mount and you're looking out, then this is what you would be seeing as well. All right, we're talking about the northern entrance. This was the northern entrance over here. So on the north side, there was only one entrance, as you can see it over here. It was called the Tadi Gate, T-A-D-I. This gateway was unique in shape. Everything else was straight on the top, and this was triangular. Some say that's why it was given this name Tadi, which in Greek means high. So it had like a triangular shape. Then going on to the west, on the western side, we had a bunch of different entrances. To be precise, you had 4 entrances on the western side. You had one entrance called the Kiphonis, also known as Warren's Gate. That is one. Here you are, view from the inside of the western wall excavation. So we're starting all over here. This is where we're starting, all the way on this side. That's the Kiphonis entrance, Warren's Gate, as it's called. Next, we have called the Wilson's Arch, which is this entrance right over here, using this overpass. And that is what you're looking at today. So when you go to the western wall and you look up onto your left-hand side and you see this kind of walkway going up onto the actual Temple Mount, so that is what you're looking at. So just to go back, so today when you're standing at the western wall, you're standing right over here where my mouse is, and when you look to your left-hand side, you're seeing this walkway that'll take you onto the Temple Mount. That is the second entrance that we're talking about, called the Wilson's Arch. So what it looks like today underneath those arches. All right, third entrance you had was called, just going to rush through this, called the Barclays Gate. Lastly, you have what they call the Robinson's Arch, which was the 4th entrance. And that also, you have to kind of go up a bunch of different stairs to get from street level onto the Temple Mount. It was a monumental staircase, crossed 42 feet over the Tyropian Way. So if you remember, I was telling you before that at the bottom over here during the time of the Second Temple, so it was called Tyropian Way and was a big shopping center. So they built the stairs in a very impressive way, that the stairs kind of went over you. So that was pretty impressive feet as well. This is something what it would look like from a little bit of a closer angle. That was if you wanted to get a workout while going into the temple, you went this way. This is what it looks like somewhat today. It doesn't look like the staircase is still there. This looks like kind of the remnants of the staircase. This would look like this Taropian way underneath structure. Lastly, the southern entrance. Here's what it's looking like today. Okay, you have the steps at the southern entrance. Southern entrance, the way it looks like today. So apparently, in the south, there would be some doors that were used for entering and some doors that were used for exiting, which is what you're seeing. On the southern side, you have these things called the Hulda tunnels, which we're not going to have time to get into today.